Welcome to week 6 for Fundamentals of Critical Reading. And this is a late week 6 due to the fact that we had Thanksgiving break last week. But I did want to break week 6 and week 7 up because I think it's a lot to talk about chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 all in one sitting. So we're going to break it up into 7 and 8 for week 6 and 9 and 10 for week 7. Week 7's video will still be uploaded separately this week. It will just be later on in the week. So let's get started. Week 7, we do not have babies for welfare money. This chapter talks about our author's pregnancy and the different expectations that she realized was placed on her based on her socioeconomic status of being living in poverty. So she talks about how really having multiple kids is one way that richer people tend to judge poorer people for having more kids than they can support. But she goes into detail as to why having more than one kid just is not that much more expensive, and how there are benefits, the same benefits for people who are rich and have multiple kids. Those are the same benefits for people who are poor, such as, a friend for your child, and also because when you have more than one child, they can actually develop faster and learn from each other. And so she talks about how people are judged when they're poor for ending up pregnant without having plans to be pregnant. But she puts a lot of this blame back on society by talking about Planned Parenthood and how people try to restrict access to ways of preventing pregnancies. Also, she talks about how inexpensive it can be when having a baby, that having a baby is expensive only if you want it to be. And she compares this back to, how people have been having babies since forever, and they didn't always have money. Think in terms of, history and going back hundreds of years, parents didn't have the luxuries that we have today as parents. So it's only expensive if you make it expensive. She also talked about when a woman is pregnant, they are offered more ways of taking care of themselves through the government. And once they have babies, how that changes. If you look on 120, I've talked about what it's like to be impoverished and pregnant, but the bare fact remains that I wound up pregnant and then hit full impoverishment. I had to figure out how I'd make it work. What I figured was this: kids everything adults can, and they don't eat nearly as much until they hit puberty. And thank God WIC could cover the formula until we were back on our feet. Children themselves do not actually require much. 2 families living on one poor person's income, though, or one family on no income, is impossible no matter how little they need. She talks about how SNAP benefits from the government. Her family from being able to get the benefits they needed from the VA. And that was one reason that she ended up in such a poor predicament while having kids. And like on the bottom of 125 where she says, I have the solution to hungry children in America. Nobody wants to do it, but here it goes. fucking feed people, cancel the programs where we pay farmers not to farm and grow food, buy it from them and use it in schools, create real jobs, fund SNAP, stop calling it welfare and start calling it something that describes what it is, a subsidy like any other, so that the people actually moving this huge wheel of capitalism can live decent, maybe basic, but still pleasant lives, hunger solved. So she's arguing that we should just give everyone food, anyone who wants it. It should be a, not extravagant amount, but a basic amount for every person. Because in her mind, that if people are expected to work at the bottom rungs and not make much money, they should still be able to eat and not have to worry about hunger. She talks about how richer people tend to think poorly of poorer people for having kids and not being able to take into consideration their educations. But then she, again, throws this back on to the system in terms of, well, everybody's supposed to be funding the public education system, which we do through taxes. But when we start throwing in all these private schools, that's whenever you start seeing a huge split between socioeconomic statuses within the public school and the private school, and how much differently the students are being treated. And she says that's not the way the system's supposed to work. It's not supposed to be all the rich kids get the better teachers at the private institutions because they pay more. It's supposed to be public institutions are as good of an institution for education as private schools are. She also talks about how children rarely know that they're poor. It doesn't affect them as it does us, unless you look at kids as a brand, like at the bottom of 130. So the problem of childbearing as an extension of your own personal brand sort of transcends social class. So in the next section, she starts talking about how basically it's the way the system is set up in terms of whether we have people who are breeding for cash benefits. It says, look on page 132, if you are desperate enough to be breeding for cash benefits, you are for all practical purposes having kids in order to be poor enough for the government to give you a full-time job. See, the reason everyone says that you get more money for having kids is that your benefits are determined by both your income and household size. So to make it an income stream, you have to decrease your non-benefit income and or increase your household size sufficiently. That, I think, is probably pretty rare. And if you think about it for a few seconds, I think you will see how ridiculous the whole idea of it is. I would be like breaking your leg. Or, I'm sorry, it would be like breaking your leg so you can go to the hospital because they'll feed you while you're there. So, true, there probably might be a few who are out there trying to exploit the system, but for the most part, you have to live on such a small amount of money to be able to qualify for these benefits that in the end, it's all going to end up hurting you and your children more, and most people are not trying to do that. She also talks about how she was visited by healthcare workers after she had given birth to her first child. And she talks about the crazy questions they ask, such as, do you have a job? And she would say, not at the moment, because she just gave birth. And another one was, do you have a permanent home? And her answer was no. This was when their apartment was flooded and they were fighting with their landlord about housing. And what was her education level? College dropout. And if anyone in the home had been diagnosed with mental disorder. And she said yes. She was pretty convinced they weren't going to let her take her daughter home, but she was healthy enough, and it's not like she was the first uninsured woman to get pregnant. So a lot of times, conditions that you would think, if you're sitting in one of those higher economic classes, is that people shouldn't be able to take their baby home if they don't have a home. People shouldn't be able to take their baby home if they don't have a job, or if they have a mental health disorder. Well, none of those things are illegal. They are constructs that our society puts on people, and people should live up to our standards, but they are not required to, not by law. And you can't take someone's child away from them for not doing those things. Now, she compares this to a neighbor who was investigated because she was at work too much. And they asked her the same sort of questions, like, how many hours are you gone? Have you considered cutting back? And she said they spoke a lot about marriage during her sessions, making her boyfriend a permanent fixture. And the whole time that the authorities were shaming her for her working so much, she was thinking about nannies. See, if she'd been wealthy enough to hire a nanny, it wouldn't matter how much she was gone. But she was only talking to the authorities because she doesn't get paid enough to hire a nanny. So we boxes where society expects the poor to be able to give their children the same lifestyle that the wealthy can give their children, but that's just not the way it is. And then they're judged harshly for not being able to provide those things. But it's not that they don't want to provide those things, it's that their position in life, their job, their career doesn't allow them to have the same financial status and ability to afford those things. She also talks about the differences in which kids are treated. And she says what it comes down to then is the idea that the very same situations and behaviors are treated completely differently depending on how nice your stuff is. Kid gets into a fight at school. If he's black and poor, he's going to jail. If he's rich and white, he's going to military school. Was your daughter busted with drugs? If she's poor, she's getting charged. If she's rich, she'll go to a nice rehab facility for however long propriety demands. The only reason it looks like our kids misbehave more is that we can't often afford to cover up for them when they do. And then she sums it up by saying, I'm not saying that poor kids have the same opportunities as rich kids. They don't. And that's bullshit. But that is not the same thing as saying that the poor are not capable of being decent, loving parents of decent people. Besides, if we don't keep having kids, who do you think is going to work in tomorrow's restaurants? Your kids? So it really kind of completes that cycle of life for her, that you have the poor who are creating so that they can serve the rich, but they want to be told they're not good parents because they're not rich. So it's kind of a catch-22 for these parents. Let's look at chapter 8 now.